Welcome to video number 4, Unalienable Rights. Before we get into this topic, I would like to expand on the previous video. This is one of the most fundamental building blocks of this whole discussion. It ties everything together and is the main reason I am doing this. At this moment in our history, socialism is gaining mainstream acceptance as a viable alternative system of government. As we said before, we repeat the mistakes of our past because each generation needs to learn everything from scratch. And what is being taught throughout the educational system is that socialism is a good idea. The following is a quotation from John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, 1690. The theory is rooted in the laws of nature that Locke identifies, which permit individuals to appropriate and exercise control or rights over things in the world. The concept of private property, like land and other material resources. Quote, "Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person," meaning you own yourself. "This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature had provided and left it in, he had mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property." Meaning when you change what nature creates or leaves for you and you put your own work onto it, that makes that belong to you. It is your own property. "It being him," this is still quote, "who removed it from the common state nature placed it, it had his labor annexed to it. This exclude the common right of other men." That means when you do that and you put your labor into something, you exclude other people from taking it from you. "For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to its fruits. He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. I ask again, when did they begin to be his? When he digested? Or when he ate? Or when he boiled? Or when he brought them home? Or when he picked them up?" Locke answered these questions by selecting the last of these options, when he picked them up. The acorns became the private property of the owner when he picked them up, for it was in the gathering that labor was first expended. Quote, "That labor put a distinction between them and common. That added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done, and so they became his property." End of quote. But this raises a crucial question. Quote, "Was it a robbery to assume to himself what belonged to all in common?" Now Locke replied to this that to require universal consent would lead to universal starvation. So, following this line of reasoning, the smallest, most basic, fundamental unit of private property that every single one of us owns is ourselves. We are the owners of our body, mind, spirit, and consciousness. This is the concept or idea of individual liberty in the most profound, pure, and absolute form. Liberty doesn't get any more basic than this. Nobody, be it another human being or governmental institution, should be able to infringe upon your private property, your personal liberty, your being, your existence. It is your God-given right. From this follows your right to life. Now, you may notice that I inverted Jefferson's order in that famous phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I did this because I believe that without liberty, which should be the first word, life becomes in many respects meaningless. You may have also noticed that I sneaked in the God concept in there, and this is a good time to address it. Quote, Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Then it continues, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson. I am sure you have seen and heard these words before, but have you ever taken the time to really understand them in all their meaning and significance? Do you see and appreciate the way in which they affect your personal life today, even though they were written 240 plus years ago? Now, back to the God concept. Jefferson writes, quote, the laws of nature and nature's God, and all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. What does he mean? Well, he is acknowledging the existence of a non-physical source from which our being and all our fundamental rights spring from. The purpose of this acknowledgement is to make sure it is understood that individual human rights are innate. They are part of the package. No single person or government gives them to you. They are a part of you. They come from a source that is beyond the human sphere of influence. This has to be the most fundamental concept ever expressed in politics. And yet, today, there are millions of Americans who have never heard or have never had this idea explained to them in all its meaning and significance. There are only two possible sources from which your human rights can come from. The one expressed by the Declaration of Independence, or a human source, be it a king, an emperor, or any other form of governmental power. We need to go back to the historical context in which these words were written to fully appreciate them. Up until then, with the exception of a few limited republics in the ancient world, like Greece, most of humanity had been organized under some form of tyranny or absolute power. Webster's dictionary defines tyranny as, quote, a government in which absolute power is vested in a single ruler, and as a cruel and unfair treatment by people with power over other people. In this period of history, it was still accepted by many that the king derived his powers from a divine source, meaning God. He gave his subjects whatever rights he wanted to give them, and could take those rights away anytime he pleased. It was again John Locke who developed a long argument against the idea of divine power being bestowed on the figure of the king by God. This absurd belief was based on the idea that there was an unbroken line of succession of kings, starting with Adam. Yes, the one in the Garden of Eden. This was the kind of thinking the founders were fighting. The Declaration of Independence takes a giant leap by knocking off the intermediary. From the source, which is nature's God, individual rights flow directly and equally to every human being. This is the underlying meaning of the phrases, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Created equal means that no person, the king more specifically, has a divine claim or of having been created any differently than anybody else. This abolishes the whole concept of divine rule of human over human, including the artificial differences among classes of human beings derived from the concept of hereditary aristocracy. It's hard to understand in our present historical context how anybody can believe that a king is endowed by God with the power to rule over others. But that was the belief of many at the time. While most people would agree on the absurdity of divine rule bestowed on a single human being, there are many people today who see nothing wrong with the idea that you can eliminate the concept of nature's God as the only source of individual human rights. When you do that, you necessarily create a vacuum which needs to be filled by the only other possible source, the government, as a representative of the state, in an abstract sense, which in turn translates into reality in our current historical time as statism. We can define this term as the principle of concentrated major political and economic controls in the hands of the state, or the unbridled power of the bureaucracy, down to the lowly individual bureaucrat who can make our lives miserable without us ever knowing who he or she is. Going back, quote, are created equal. Let's address some of the misconceptions floating out there in popular culture and in college campuses. You might have heard arguments like these. Quote, how can the Declaration say that we are all created equal when it's obvious that is not true? We all have different physical and mental attributes. Or, another one is, what happened to the concept of created equal? Doesn't that mean that we are all entitled to an equal outcome in life? Both these claims, as you can see, become absurd when we understand the real meaning behind the words. What about this one? These guys were hypocrites. They owned slaves, did not include women, and considered black slaves 3/5 of a person. Without giving it much scrutiny and thought, you can say, yeah, these were all male, white, racist, old farts. Why would we put them on a pedestal? This way of thinking, which is very prominent and prevalent in the halls of academia, is very short-sighted and shows a complete lack of understanding of history. You have to apply a different perspective and understand the historical and social parameters in which these people lived. They were so ahead of their time that they could look beyond their societal norms and could see a set of absolutes that would eventually apply to all humans in the future. They constructed an ideal blueprint based on belief of absolute truths. Can we, as imperfect human beings, achieve this ideal completely? No. Were they themselves perfect human beings? Obviously not. But they gave us this framework of absolutes against which we can measure, compare, and analyze the relative world in which we live. It gives us an ideal we can strive toward. Having that standard to follow pulls us towards good and away from our base nature. It acts as a moral, social, and political compass. To answer the previously mentioned criticism, created equal means equal outcomes, I found that the following opening lines of chapter 13 from Owen's Sisters, 1902 novel, The Virginian, are worth transcribing here. Quote, there can be no doubt of this. All America is divided into two classes, the quality and the equality. The latter, equality, will always recognize the former quality when mistaken for it. Both will be with us until our women bear nothing but kings. It was through the Declaration of Independence that we Americans acknowledged the eternal equality of man. For by it we abolished a cut and dry aristocracy. We had seen little men artificially held up in high places, and great men artificially held down in low places. And our own justice-loving hearts abhorred this violence to human nature. Therefore, we decreed that every man should thenceforth have equal liberty to find his own level. By this very decree, we acknowledged and gave freedom to true aristocracy, saying, "Let the best man win, whoever he is. Let the best man win." That is America's word. That is true democracy. And true democracy and true aristocracy are one and the same thing. If anybody cannot see this, so much worse for his eyesight. This brilliant passage expresses the basic idea of the essential equality of every human being by the mere fact of existence, but it acknowledges at the same time the inherent and natural differences that exist. Note, I will address the 3/5 clause in a chapter on slavery. So, as a summary, the basic unit of property is the self. Liberty is the ownership of your being in the broadest, most basic sense. Human rights are innate and from a source beyond the sphere of human influence. Statism is the opposite view regarding the source of human rights. Academia and popular culture has a very short-sighted view of the founders. The nation was built on an ideal supported by absolute truths. Perfection is not achievable in the human realm. The blueprint acts as an incentive to improve and to strive towards. Thank you. See you next one.